2025 was a great year for horror films. Movies like Sinners, Weapons, and Frankenstein had widespread recognition and even getting attention by the awards institutions, film festivals, and having box office success. As a person who works in the film industry, I have seen producers disregarding the genre for being too gimmicky or saying it's too niche. However, in the past few years, the horror genre has taken a tour de force, having success not only with audiences. In order to explain and explore the impact of horror in 2025, I have to start in the past and origins of the horror genre in cinema as a whole. This is Cinema Essay, and this is the year horror took over. Horror as a genre has existed for a very long time. It comes from folk tales that warn people not to enter a forest or teaching kids to behave. Legends, myths and culture have been expressed through this type of storytelling. When film arrived and became popular, people went to see horror stories to the cinemas. Movies like The Golem by Paul Wegener took legends and folk tales as source of inspiration, or The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari by Robert Wiener, which took personal experience to be portrayed as a response of the horrors of war. Out of all the genres, horror might be the only one named after a specific emotion. This might create expectations to be scared before even watching any horror movie. However, through the years, the folklore, the legends, and evolution of the genre, this expectation might be one of the reasons the genre was regarded as cheap or gimmicky. In prestigious institutions like festivals and awards often saw horror as one that might not have the artistic freedom all genres have, placing expectations and specific responses on the audience even before watching the movie. However, that perception did not appear overnight. As cinema evolved through the early 20th century, horror was often pushed to the margins, thriving creatively but rarely receiving institutional validation. Even as films like Nosferatu expanded the visual language of cinema, horror was still treated as an outlier, admired quietly but excluded from the quote-unquote serious filmmaking. The rise of sound cinema did little to change this reputation. Horror flourished with Universal monsters in the 1930s, creating icons like Dracula and Frankenstein. But these films were marketed primarily as spectacle. They were popular, influential, and profitable, yet rarely discussed as art. Horror became something audiences loved, but critics and institutions kept at arm's length. The post-war era brought new anxieties and new forms of horror. The genre absorbed fears of science, invasion, and societal collapse. Especially during the Cold War, science fiction and horror began to overlap, reflecting nuclear dread and paranoia. Even then, horror remained coded as genre entertainment rather than cultural commentary, despite clearly mirroring the fears of its time. A major shift came with filmmakers who used horror as a social critique. George A. Romero redefined the zombie film with Night of the Living Dead, transforming a low-budget horror movie into an allegory about consumerism, racism, and social breakdown. Romero proved that horror could confront reality head-on, using fear as a lens instead of a goal. Around the same time, Alfred Hitchcock blurred the line between horror and prestige cinema. Films like Psycho and The Birds were undeniably horrifying, yet Hitchcock was never dismissed as a genre filmmaker. His success exposed an underlying contradiction. Horror was acceptable when it wore a different label. The 1970s saw horror explode in popularity, but also deepen in stigma. Slashers dominated theaters, creating cultural phenomena but reinforcing the idea of horror as formulaic and disposable. Then The Exorcist arrived in 1973. This movie proved its thematic and emotional gravity. William Friedkin's film confronted audiences with questions of faith, doubt, and spiritual collapse at a level rarely attempted in mainstream cinema. Its restrained direction, documentary-like realism, and commitment to psychological intensity grounded the supernatural in lived human experience. The Exorcist was not dismissed as a cult film or genre outlier. It became a cultural event, earning major critical recognition and multiple Academy Award nominations. In doing so, it shattered the assumption that horror could not engage seriously with philosophy, religion, and existential fear, forcing institutions to momentarily acknowledge what the genre was capable of. In 1975, Steven Spielberg's Jaws marked another crucial turning point. Often labeled the first modern blockbuster, the film demonstrated that fear could be engineered with the highest level of cinematic craft while still reaching massive audiences. Spielberg's precise control of pacing, framing, sound, and the strategic withholding of information transformed horror into a carefully constructed experience rather than just a shock. Yet Jaws is rarely fully acknowledged as a horror film. It is more often described as a thriller or a film with horror elements, even though creature and monster movies would later be fully embraced as legitimate expressions of horror. This reluctance reveals how horror's influence was accepted, while the genre itself was still denied. Despite this, horror continued to evolve beneath the surface. Independent cinema embraced the genre as a space for experimentation. Low budget encouraged risk and innovation. Horror became a laboratory for visual language, narrative structure, and thematic boldness. International cinema also played a crucial role. Horror from Asia, Europe, and Latin America brought new mythologies, new rhythms, and new philosophies to the genre. These films demonstrated that horror was not just entertainment, but a cultural mirror shaped by geography, history, and belief systems. As the years went by, a noticeable shift began to take form. Filmmakers started reclaiming horror as a legitimate artistic tool, openly engaging with grief, trauma, identity, and existential dread. The genre became slower, more introspective, and more metaphor-driven, challenging the expectations that had once confined it. In the 90s, The Silence of the Lambs was released, highlighting the persistent tension between horror and institutional labeling. The film draws heavily from horror through its imagery, psychological intensity, and human monstrosity, while also functioning as a procedural thriller. Yet it's rarely categorized exclusively as horror, even as it embraces the genre's defining tools. Its sweeping success at the Academy Awards revealed a familiar pattern. Horror is often accepted only when it's renamed. The film stands as a reminder that horror long operated at the center of the prestigious cinema, even when it was denied the label. Directors like Guillermo del Toro exemplified the transition from denial to full embrace. His films fused fairy tales, political allegory, and emotional intimacy, treating horror not as a disguise but as a language. Del Toro's monsters are not metaphors to be hidden but emotional centers that reflect human cruelty. Pan's Labyrinth marked a decisive turning point, earning widespread critical acclaim, major awards, and being accepted in the most prestigious film festivals around the world, while embracing horror imagery openly and without apology. This momentum continued with a new generation of filmmakers. Robert Eggers used historical accuracy and folklore to create films like The Witch and The Lighthouse, works that felt closer to art house cinema than traditional horror. These films demanded attention, but through atmosphere and psychological immersion. Jordan Peele's work further demonstrated how horror could function as a form of cultural language, rather than simple genre entertainment. Get Out used the structure of horror to articulate social anxieties with precision and accessibility, embedding its commentary directly into the mechanics of fear. The film's success culminated in Peele's winning the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, a moment that signaled a broader shift in institutional perception. By integrating social critique seamlessly into mainstream horror, filmmakers like Peele helped dismantle the artificial divide between genre cinema and so-called prestige cinema. By the early 2020s, this evolution could no longer be framed as an exception or niche movement. Horror had quietly embedded itself into the core of contemporary cinema, influencing not only genre filmmaking but directors working across drama, fantasy, and even historical narratives. Its visual grammar, thematic boldness, and willingness to confront the unconfrontable truths began shaping the broader cinematic language. Films like Sinners, Weapons, The Ugly Stepsister, If I Had Legs I'd Kick You, and Frankenstein exemplified this shift in 2025. These projects were not content with functioning as genre exercises. They were positioned as cultural events. They premiered at major festivals, entered the world conversations, and were discussed alongside prestige dramas, signaling a decisive break from the idea that horror exists outside serious cinema. What distinguished these films was not merely their subject matter, but their intent. They used horror as a framework to explore morality, faith, violence, and identity, often engaging directly with contemporary anxieties. Fear became a structural element rather than a gimmick, allowing filmmakers to address reality through metaphor with greater emotional precision. This recognition did not emerge suddenly, nor was it granted freely. It followed years of horror films being quietly shortlisted, nominated, and occasionally awarded across international festivals. Cannes, Venice, Berlin, Sundance, and Toronto all played roles slowly legitimizing the genre, creating space for horror to exist without disguise. Award institutions followed cautiously at first. Horror films began appearing in technical categories, then writing, then direction and performance. These institutions mattered not because they validated horror, but because they exposed long-standing biases in how cinematic value had been defined. At the same time, horror's commercial dominance strengthened its position. The genre demonstrated an unmatched consistency at the global box office. With comparatively modest budgets, horror films generated high returns, proving that artistic ambition and financial viability were not mutually exclusive. Equally important was the genre's international reach. Horror thrives across borders, adapting to local myths, histories, and traumas while remaining universally legible. This global resonance reinforced horror's role as a cultural language rather than a regional curiosity. In 2025, Sinners became the most nominated film in the Academy Award history, with 16 nominations. Contemporary filmmakers fully embraced this potential. Robert Eggers, Ari Aster, Guillermo del Toro, Ryan Coogler, Coralie Forja, and many more represent different approaches but share a common understanding. Horror is a vessel for meaning. Their films do not seek permission to be taken seriously, they demand engagement through craft and intent. What unites modern horror is its refusal to reassure. Unlike many traditional prestige films, horror does not offer easy catharsis or moral clarity. It reflects a world marked by uncertainty, systemic failure, and unresolved trauma, making it uniquely suited to the present moment. This honestly is why horror has cultivated one of the most loyal and informed audiences in cinema. Viewers recognize when fear is being used thoughtfully. They return not only for sensation, but for reflection, interpretation, and emotional identity. By 2025, the conversation had shifted entirely. Horror was no longer asking to be included in cinema's upper circles. It was already there, shaping the speech, aesthetics, and expectations, redefining what cinematic excellence could look like. This is not the year horror became respectable. This is the year cinema finally caught up to what horror had been doing all along. This was everything for today, and thank you so much for watching. Please leave a comment, like and share, and see you next time.